AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. Brett Johnson with you here on a Tuesday afternoon. Well, of course, we are less than 2 months away from the election here in Minnesota and, of course, around the entire country. So we have lots to talk to in terms of electoral politics and especially what's happening in the Minnesota state legislature. So joining us to talk about that, as well as some other of the great work that's happening at the Minnesota Reformer, is Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer, which you can find their work over at minnesotareformer.com. Patrick, thanks so much for coming back on the show today.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. So let's start off talking about, before we get into the electoral politics, I want to talk about an article that Madison McVan recently wrote today, because Madison recently looked at the impact of large-scale livestock farming in southern Minnesota, where hogs outnumber people in some areas by a 40-to-1 margin. Now, while hog production is booming, it does come with environmental risks, which we are going to discuss. In fact, environmental activist organization Food and Water Watch released new maps showing the concentration of livestock in southern Minnesota being among the highest in the entire country, in fact, even higher than some areas of Iowa. So let's talk a little bit more about this. Factory farms or concentrated animal feeding operations, which is the definition according to the federal government, are considered highly efficient farms. But what makes these operations what I'm curious about, Patrick, is what makes these operations so profitable, and why do we have so many of them specifically located in southern Minnesota?
Well, it's the sheer efficiency. The agriculture operations like these environments because they can cram thousands of hogs into a barn, and it just allows you to produce more product for cheaper. It's as simple as that. It's just sort of like anything else in capitalism, where you get specialization and with it more efficiency.
Now, what also was mentioned during Madison's write-up was that during June flooding, at least 17 manure pits overflowed in southern Minnesota. So let's talk about how such incidents impact the local ecosystems and drinking water supplies, because this can be a problem when you have a lot of these consolidated livestock areas where they're put in one area. You can end up with a lot of runoff from the manure that eventually gets turned into fertilizer, causing a lot of environmental problems. So let's talk about the impact that these can have on ecosystems when you have these overflow like we had back in June with some flooding in Minnesota.
Right. I mean, as you mentioned, the ratio in some southern Minnesota counties of 40 hogs for every human, and they produce a lot of waste, and the waste has a lot of nitrates, and the nitrates contaminates water, and then you've got all kinds of other farm runoff. So, insofar as we have water quality problems, especially in the southern part of the state, this has to be part of the conversation. And there's also a really spotty regulatory regime when it comes to overseeing these operations and their safety.
And final question for you on this, and this has to do with the state legislature, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But of course, with flooding and other natural disasters, that can really exacerbate some of the risks that are posed by these large livestock operations. Are there any discussions at the state capitol among legislatures to try to mitigate these risks in Minnesota? Or is this something that more kind of the environmental activist groups are looking at the legislature to do in the future to help mitigate some of the problems we could have when we do have natural disasters or other disasters on these livestock areas?
It's very difficult because the agribusiness lobby is very powerful, and that's bipartisan. Nobody wants to be perceived as anti-farmer or anti-agriculture, and so it makes progress at the legislature difficult. But I suspect there is some kind of a breaking point, and especially since Democrats become so much more concentrated in the cities and suburbs, where they have just fewer members who are in Greater Minnesota and need to keep close ties to the ag lobby.
We'll read more about what Madison reported on this, including that map, just showing how concentrated these livestock farming operations are in southern Minnesota. Find that over at minnesotareformer.com. Again, minnesotareformer.com, right on the front page. Want to switch gears now and talk a little politics and election season, since obviously that is coming up. We're going to be discussing the legislature. But before we get to that, I want to talk about something that came out from State Senator Omar Fatah, who, of course, represents a district in Minneapolis, because he recently called for a moratorium on new charter schools after a recent Star Tribune article reported on many of the problems with charter schools throughout Minnesota, even though we were one of the pioneers in this state for charter schools. Now, as you wrote, Patrick, you said this will likely endear him to Education Minnesota and other supporters of strengthening public education. And Fatah now is considered a possible candidate for mayor. So I'm curious, why is there this speculation around him possibly running for mayor, even though that office technically doesn't have a whole lot to do with managing public education in Minnesota? Let's talk about this speculation of him possibly running for mayor in Minneapolis.
Well, he's seen around the Capitol as a ambitious political player. He had a couple of big pieces of legislation attached to him. One was free tuition at the Minnesota State colleges and universities for families that who make $85,000 or less. He was also an important player in the Uber Lyft driver minimum pay issue. So he's got a high profile, and people that I've spoken to have said these discussions are happening in his camp. He doesn't return the reformers' calls, and we were not able to get a direct confirmation, but secondhand, a lot of people are talking about this. And it's certainly, the job of mayor, I think, especially since it was strengthened by the 2021 ballot initiative. I'm sure it's appealing when you're one of 67, especially in the state Senate, where the Democratic control is really on a knife's edge. The idea of being mayor and really being able to shape the future of a city is probably pretty appealing. So I honestly, I used that tweet of his as a vehicle to talk about his mayoral ambitions. But I also think it's interesting as something that we may be seeing, thanks to that Star Tribune series, a real sea change in how Democrats especially view charter schools.
Yeah, I could see that change definitely happening as well, as they're generally not quite as friendly as they were in years and decades past here in the state. Want to move on now and talk about races in the state legislature, because the Minnesota Republican Party appears to be in better financial shape than they've been, well, in quite some time. As the Minnesota GOP says, they set a record fundraising haul, bringing in about $1.8 million per their upcoming September report, with about $1.6 million cash on hand, which is quite a bit more than what they used to have. I think during their lowest point when they had, I believe, something like $5 or $6 total cash on hand in their accounts. But they've already made more in total contributions than in the 2022 election cycle, and they beat their previous 2018 cash haul. So my question for you is, do you think the GOP's fundraising performance is going to significantly impact the competitiveness of House races in Minnesota? Because they've raised a boatload of money, but I think you've also brought up the point, at least in your write-up in the Reformer email this morning, that typically in Minnesota we do have more Democrats than Republicans. So I'm interested in what impact this fundraising haul could have for Republicans as they try to win that race for control of the state legislature.
Yeah, first I want to note that the financial problems, the House Republicans caucus, they've always kind of done their own thing. So it's important to keep them, distinguish them from the state GOP, which
yes.
is kind of a long dumpster fire, for lack of a better phrase. But the House GOP tend to be a better run operation. But I do think it's important that they are raising all this money. I think there's a lot of Republicans who saw the 2023 legislative session, and it's motivated them to act. A lot of business folks who believe the state went too far in one direction. Also interesting that they have more total contributors than in 2022. That says to me that they've got a small dollar donor program going. You're not going to win on the basis of this fundraising, but it's important to have a certain minimum amount so that you can at least be in the hunt. And beyond that, you need good candidates who are going to work hard, work and knock on doors. Because a lot of these races are going to be decided by sometimes just dozens of votes, very often hundreds, and often the margin will be how many doors did that candidate knock on, and was he or she able to make the sale? But a lot of this will also be out of their control. It's going to be the national environment, which will trickle down. And I think overall, at least in Minnesota, it feels like a pretty good environment for Democrats. They have Tim Walz at the top of the ticket, which is certainly going to drive up Democratic turnout. And it seems as if Kamala Harris has shored up Democratic performance with younger voters. So it seems like it's going to be a good year, and I kind of jokingly talk about the super secret key to Minnesota politics is that there are more Democrats than Republicans, as you said. People don't seem to get this, despite the fact that Democrats have won every statewide race here since 2006. So all in all, I think it was always going to be a tough hills to climb for Republicans to take back the House. I thought it was doable, especially with Biden at the top of the ticket. I think it's less so now, but the reality is the way the map is drawn, and the Democrats still have this problem. A lot of their voters are packed into these urban districts. So I still think Republicans have an outside shot, but right now it looks to me like Democrats are on track to keep the House, depending on how some of these battleground districts go.
Well, one of those battleground districts that could be a big bellwether for control of the state legislature is District 26A in southeastern Minnesota, which includes Winona and some of the surrounding cities and counties in that area. And outgoing DFL Representative Gene Pelosi recently made some remarks cited by Republicans to argue for ending one-party control. Now, granted, these comments were largely taken out of context, but I'm curious, do you think these could impact the race in District 26A? I know you had a chance to speak with a DFL source who had some thoughts on this race. So let's talk about this one and what that impact could be in District 26A, since that could be a real bellwether for how the control of the state legislature will be determined this fall.
Yeah, I mean, it's an important pickup for Republicans. Democrats seem to think that even if they were to lose that seat, they're going to get their own pickups in the metro, or up north there's a couple seats. They're also looking at the Dotseth race. This is the state legislator Republican north of the Twin Cities, who is accused in court papers of long-running domestic violence against wife and stepson. And so even though that's a Republican-leaning district, Democrats feel like they can take that one, or at least force Republicans to play a lot of defense there, which would take resources away from swing districts where Democrats can flip a Republican seat. So, I mean, every seat matters when it's this close, but I feel like Democrats probably can lose a district like that Winona district, which is certainly trending Republican over the years, because there's plenty more in the metro that are trending Democratic.
Well, make sure you read about all of Patrick's commentary on the races by subscribing to the newsletter that the Minnesota Reformer sends out every morning. You can find that over at minnesotareformer.com. And, of course, follow all the great reporting they do as well over at minnesotareformer.com. We have been speaking with Patrick Coolican, who is the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Reformer, talking politics, the race from the state legislature, as well as Madison's great article talking about these livestock operations being heavily concentrated in southern Minnesota. Again, go to minnesotareformer.com. Patrick, as always, thanks for coming on the show today.
Always a pleasure, Brett.
All right, let's take a break and send things back over to Matt McNeil on AM 950.